They told him it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to capture the island. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki stood on the command deck of his reinforced concrete bunker on Batio Island, looking out across the lagoon in the early morning darkness of November 20th, 1943. He had spent 14 months transforming this coral atoll into what he believed was the most formidable defensive position in the Central Pacific. Every pillbox had been positioned with interlocking fields of fire. Every approach had been mined, wired, and ranged for artillery. The tide schedules had been calculated precisely. The defensive doctrine had been perfected through careful study of previous amphibious assaults. At 04:41 hours, the first salvos from American battleships began to fall. Shells weighing as much as a small automobile crashed into his fortifications. Shibasaki did not flinch. His bunkers had been built to withstand this. The concrete walls were 4 feet thick in places, reinforced with steel rails taken from the island's narrow-gauge railway. Sand and coconut logs provided additional cushioning against the concussion. His men, the Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's equivalent of Marines, were trained, disciplined, and deeply committed to the doctrine of decisive battle at the water's edge. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Shibasaki's confidence was not misplaced arrogance. It was the product of careful military calculation. The Japanese Imperial Navy had studied every major amphibious operation in modern warfare. They had examined British failures at Gallipoli in World War I. They had reviewed their own successful landings in China and Southeast Asia. They had developed a comprehensive defensive philosophy specifically designed to defeat American amphibious doctrine. The theory was simple, brutal, and logical. Destroy the enemy at his most vulnerable moment, when he is transitioning from sea to land, when his men are packed in boats, when his heavy weapons cannot yet be brought to bear. Batio Island, the primary landmass of Tarawa Atoll, measured just 2 miles long and 800 yards at its widest point. The entire island was barely 300 acres. A man could walk its perimeter in less than 2 hours. But on this tiny scrap of coral, Shibasaki had constructed a defensive system that represented the evolved thinking of Japanese military engineers. 500 pillboxes and firing positions, 40 artillery pieces, including 8-inch naval guns taken from British ships captured at Singapore, 14 coastal defence guns, 40 light tanks buried in revetments as stationary fire points, 1,300 coconut log obstacles driven into the reef and lagoon floor, miles of barbed wire, thousands of mines, and 4,800 men willing to die rather than surrender. The American ships offshore carried the 2nd Marine Division. These men had trained for over a year specifically for this operation. They had practiced amphibious landings on Hawaiian beaches. They had studied aerial photographs and intelligence reports. They carried new equipment, including a revolutionary tracked landing vehicle called the LVT Landing Vehicle Tract that could crawl across reefs where conventional landing craft would ground out. Their commanders believed they had planned for every contingency. Neither side yet understood what the next 76 hours would reveal. The Japanese did not comprehend the true scale of American firepower and industrial capacity. The Americans did not fully grasp the determination and defensive sophistication they were about to encounter. What happened on Batio would reshape amphibious warfare doctrine for both nations. It would produce one of the bloodiest battles per square yard in military history, and it would shatter Admiral Shibasaki's certainty that his fortress was impregnable in a time frame that would seem impossible even to the Marines who accomplished it. To understand why Shibasaki believed his defenses would hold, you must understand the evolution of Japanese amphibious warfare doctrine in the early 1940s. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting offensive amphibious operations. Their landings in China, Malaya, the Philippines, and across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 had been masterful exercises in combined arms warfare. Japanese forces had landed on defended beaches, overcome superior numbers, and conquered territories that Western military analysts had deemed defensible. But by late 1942, Japanese planners recognized that the strategic initiative had shifted. After defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, Japan would increasingly fight defensive battles. The question facing military strategists in Tokyo was fundamental. How do you defend small islands against an enemy with overwhelming naval and air superiority? The answer they developed was called Kakyu Gyokusai, the doctrine of decisive defensive battle. Rather than attempting to prevent landings entirely, which was impossible against American naval gunfire, Japanese forces would allow enemy troops to come ashore, then destroy them through prepared defenses and immediate counterattacks. This doctrine required specific engineering solutions. Pillboxes had to be built strong enough to survive naval bombardment. They needed to be positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, so that attacking one position would expose troops to fire from multiple other positions. They needed to be camouflaged so thoroughly that attackers could not identify them until they were already in the kill zone. And they needed to be supplied with sufficient ammunition, food, and water to allow defenders to fight for days or weeks without resupply. Baitio represented the most sophisticated implementation of this doctrine yet attempted. Construction had begun in August 1942, immediately after Guadalcanal demonstrated that the Americans intended to fight their way across the Pacific. Japanese engineers, along with 1,200 Korean laborers and local Gilbertese workers, had worked continuously for 14 months. They poured concrete using cement imported from Japan and mixed with coral sand. They cut coconut logs and laid them in alternating layers with coral to create shock-absorbing barriers. They positioned steel firing ports at precise angles calculated to cover specific approach lanes. The main defensive line ran along the northern shore, where intelligence indicated the Americans would land. Here, pillboxes were positioned every 50 yards. Each was a reinforced concrete structure sunk partially below ground level. The walls consisted of 3 to 4 feet of concrete, reinforced with steel rails and rebar. Inside, the firing chamber measured approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, barely large enough for a machine gun crew and ammunition storage. Ventilation came through covered ports that also served as alternate firing positions. The roof was layered: concrete, then sand, then coconut logs, then more sand, creating a cushion that would absorb shell impacts and prevent penetration. Between the pillboxes ran trenches, allowing defenders to move under cover and reinforce threatened positions. Barbed wire barriers stretched in multiple rows, some visible to channelize attackers into predetermined killing zones, others hidden in the coral rubble to entangle men who thought they had cleared the obstacles. Anti-tank ditches had been dug at key points, though Japanese planners doubted the Americans would bring armor ashore in the initial waves. The beach obstacles were particularly ingenious. Starting at the low tide line and extending hundreds of yards into the lagoon, Japanese engineers had driven coconut log posts into the coral. These were arranged in rows, angled toward the expected landing approach. Behind them were pyramidal structures called tetrahedrons, made from coconut logs lashed together and weighted with coral. These obstacles were designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, forcing troops to disembark in deep water under fire. Steel rails scavenged from the narrow-gauge railway that had once served the island's copra industry were sharpened and driven into the coral at angles, creating underwater spikes that could impale boats or men. Admiral Shibasaki's greatest natural ally was the reef itself. Tarawa Atoll sits atop a coral formation that has grown for millennia. The lagoon inside the atoll appears deceptively calm and shallow, particularly at low tide. But the reef creates a barrier that extends from the beach outward for 500 to 800 yards in most places. At high tide, there might be 4 to 5 feet of water over the reef, enough for landing craft to cross. At low tide, the depth drops to as little as 3 feet in many areas, and in some spots the coral breaks the surface entirely. American planners knew about the reef. Intelligence officers had studied charts, interviewed former residents, and analyzed aerial photographs. They had calculated tide schedules using every available source. The plan depended on landing during a high tide that would provide sufficient water depth for the Higgins boat's standard landing craft, with a draft of approximately 3 feet forward and 4 feet aft when loaded. If the tide was high enough, the boats could carry Marines directly to the beach, depositing them in shallow water, where they could wade ashore quickly under the covering fire of naval guns and aircraft. But tide prediction in the Central Pacific in 1943 was an inexact science. The Navy had limited data on the specific tidal patterns at Tarawa. Local knowledge suggested there should be adequate water depth at the time, scheduled landing time. A New Zealand officer who had lived in the Gilberts before the war warned that neap tides, the lower high tides that occur during quarter moons, could leave insufficient depth over the reef. Some planners listened, others dismissed the warning as overly cautious. The compromise solution was the LVT landing vehicle tract. These were essentially armoured tractors with boat hulls, designed originally for use in the Florida Everglades rescuing hurricane victims. The Marine Corps had requisitioned them and armoured them minimally for amphibious warfare. The LVT could float, albeit clumsily, and more importantly, it could crawl across coral reefs on its tracks. The 2nd Marine Division had 75 LVTs available for the Tarawa assault. This was enough to carry the first 3 waves of assault troops. Subsequent waves would come in on conventional Higgins boats, which the planners assumed would have adequate water depth once the tide came in. Admiral Shibasaki understood the reef's defensive value completely. His defensive plans specifically called for concentrating fire on any landing craft that grounded on the reef. Men forced to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water while carrying 60 to 70 pounds of equipment would be nearly defenseless targets. Machine guns firing from prepared positions could create a killing zone that would be almost impossible to cross. The longer the Americans remained in the water, the more casualties they would take, and the more their assault would lose momentum and cohesion. Japanese ammunition supplies had been calculated based on this expectation. Each defensive position was stocked with thousands of rounds of machine gun ammunition, hundreds of rifle cartridges, and dozens of grenades. Artillery pieces had been pre-registered on specific zones across the reef and lagoon. Forward observers occupied positions with clear views of the approaches. Communication lines ran between positions, allowing commanders to concentrate fire and call for support. The defensive doctrine emphasized patience and fire discipline. Crews were instructed not to fire at maximum range, but to wait until targets entered the optimal killing zone. This would conserve ammunition, achieve better effects, and prevent the Americans from identifying defensive positions too early. Once the assault waves were committed and trapped on the reef or in the shallow water, then Japanese gunners would open fire with everything available. The goal was not just to repel the landing, but to destroy the assault force so completely that subsequent waves would refuse to come ashore. The first wave of Marines climbed into their LVTs at 0500 hours on November 20th, 1943. These men were from the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, and the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines. They had been awake since 0300, eating a breakfast of steak and eggs, the traditional meal, before an amphibious assault, served because it was filling and because command wanted men to have a good meal before what everyone knew would be a difficult day. Each Marine carried approximately 65 pounds of equipment. A standard loadout included an M1 Garand rifle with 80 rounds of ammunition in clips, 2 hand grenades, a bayonet, an entrenching tool, a canteen with 2 quarts of water, a first aid kit, and personal items. Some men carried additional equipment: Bangalore torpedoes for clearing wire, satchel charges for destroying pillboxes, radio equipment, or extra ammunition for the squad's Browning automatic rifle. Officers carried maps, signal panels, and sometimes sidearms instead of rifles. The weight was substantial, distributed across web gear and pack, and it would become critically important in ways none of them yet imagined. The naval bombardment had begun at 0441 and continued as the LVTs circled in their staging area, waiting for the order to proceed to the line of departure. Battleships Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee fired their main batteries' 14-inch and 16-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing up to 2,400 pounds. Heavy cruisers, Indianapolis and Portland, added their 8-inch batteries. Destroyers moved closer to shore, firing 5-inch guns at specific targets identified in pre-assault planning. The noise was tremendous, a continuous rolling thunder that made conversation impossible without shouting. From the LVTs, Marines watched the island disappear behind a curtain of smoke and dust. Explosions erupted continuously across Betio. Fires burned in multiple locations. Coconut trees, which had covered much of the island before the bombardment, toppled or burst into flames. It appeared that nothing could survive such devastation. Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal or Tulagi shared cigarettes and told each other this would be easier than those battles. The Navy was pulverizing the defenses. They would go ashore, mop up stunned survivors, and secure the island by nightfall. At 0900 hours, the bombardment lifted. Naval guns shifted their aim inland, away from the beach defenses, to allow the assault waves to approach. The LVTs formed into lines and began their run toward shore. Each vehicle carried approximately 20 Marines, plus a crew of 3. The first wave consisted of 42 LVTs, carrying elements of 3 battalion landing teams. They moved in formation, engines labouring to push the ungainly vehicles through the water at their maximum speed of approximately 4 knots. The LVTs were not designed as assault vehicles. They had been armoured as an afterthought, with 1/4-inch steel plates welded to the sides and front. This provided protection against rifle fire and shell fragments, but nothing more. The vehicles had no overhead protection. Marines sat on bench seats inside, exposed to plunging fire. The armour came up to approximately chest height when seated, leaving heads and shoulders vulnerable. The Marines called them alligators or simply Amphtrax, and they had trained with them extensively, but no amount of training could prepare them for what approaching Betio would actually mean. Japanese observers watched the approaching LVTs through binoculars and rangefinders. Gun crews stood ready at their weapons, waiting for the order to fire. Admiral Shibasaki had given explicit instructions: allow the first waves to approach to point-blank range before opening fire. Wait until the Americans were committed. Wait until they could not turn back. Then destroy them. Artillery crews checked their range cards. Machine gun crews charged their weapons. Riflemen settled into firing positions with clear views of the reef and beach. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the haze from the bombardment, providing excellent visibility across the lagoon. At approximately 09:15, when the lead LVTs were roughly 500 yards from shore, Japanese guns opened fire. Every weapon that had survived the bombardment, every gun crew that had waited patiently in their reinforced positions, began firing simultaneously. The effect was devastating and immediate. Heavy machine gun fire raked the approaching LVTs. The 1/4-inch armour plate stopped some bullets, but not all. Rounds penetrated the thin plating or came over the top, striking Marines crowded inside. 40mm anti-boat guns fired directly at the LVTs, their shells capable of penetrating the light armour easily. Artillery began dropping shells into the lagoon, throwing up geysers of water mixed with coral fragments and creating near misses that could swamp or disable the tractors. The first LVT was hit within moments of the firing starting. A shell penetrated the engine compartment and the vehicle ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its rear. Marines inside scrambled over the sides into shoulder-deep water. Some made it out. Others were hit by machine gun fire as they emerged. A second LVT took a direct hit from a 40mm gun and exploded, killing everyone aboard instantly. The wreckage burned in the shallow water, marking the approach lane for following vehicles. The LVTs that survived the initial fusillade continued forward. Their drivers pushed the throttles to maximum, trying to close the distance as quickly as possible. Tracks churned the water as the vehicles transitioned from floating to crawling along the coral bottom. Marines inside hunched down as low as possible, trying to find cover behind the inadequate armor plating. Some returned fire with their rifles, shooting over the sides at muzzle flashes they could see on shore. Most simply held on and prayed. The first wave reached the reef line at approximately 922. Here, the water depth decreased from 4 or 5 feet to 3 feet or less. The LVTs, designed for this exact situation, transitioned from swimming to crawling. Their tracks gripped the coral and they lurched forward, climbing onto the reef itself. Speed decreased from 4 knots to perhaps 2 knots, the pace of a slow walk. Japanese gunners adjusted their aim, focusing on these slow-moving targets. The killing became systematic. The sound of bullets striking the armor was constant, a metallic hammering that drowned out shouted orders. Men were hit and fell without ceremony, their blood pooling on the floor plates. Others tried to help the wounded and were hit themselves. The medical corpsmen attached to each platoon worked frantically, applying pressure bandages and morphine, knowing their efforts were inadequate but trying anyway. Some LVTs took so many casualties that when they reached the beach, fewer than half the Marines who had boarded were still combat effective. The second and third waves followed in conventional Higgins boats, as planned. These were supposed to land 15 and 30 minutes after the first wave, carrying additional infantry and heavy weapons crews. But the tide had not come in as predicted. The neap tide warning that had been dismissed during planning proved accurate. Water depth over the reef ranged from 2.5 to 3.5 feet, not nearly enough for the Higgins boats with their 3 to 4 foot draft. Coxswains driving the Higgins boats pushed as far forward as they could, but one after another grounded on the reef, still 500 to 700 yards from shore. Officers faced an impossible decision: turn back and abandon the assault, or order their men into the water. Training, duty, and the momentum of the attack left only one choice. Ramps dropped. Marines stepped off into chest-deep water, holding their rifles over their heads, and began wading toward the beach. The scene that followed would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. 600, 700, 800 yards of wading through water that varied from knee-deep to chest-deep, depending on coral formations and depth variations. Men carried 65 pounds of equipment. Radios, when they got wet, stopped working. Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges became waterlogged. The weight of wet uniforms and equipment dragged at every step. The coral underfoot was sharp and uneven, with holes and crevices that could twist an ankle or cause a man to stumble, and every step was made while under continuous fire from machine guns, rifles, and artillery. Japanese gunners had pre-registered fire lanes across the entire reef approach. They knew the exact ranges. They had marked aiming points. As Marines waded forward in ragged lines, machine gun crews simply traversed their weapons back and forth, firing sustained bursts at targets that could not take cover, could not run, could barely move faster than a slow walk. Men were hit and fell face forward into the water. Some got up and continued. Others did not. Wounded men tried to make it to shore or back to the reef edge, but the distance was too great and their wounds too severe. The water turned red in patches. Artillery observers called down fire on the densest concentrations of wading Marines. Shells exploded in the shallow water, the concussion amplified by the liquid medium. Men near the impacts were killed by the shock wave, even if fragments did not strike them. Others were wounded by coral fragments thrown up by the explosions, these irregular pieces of razor-sharp stone causing terrible lacerations. Some men, hit multiple times or too badly wounded to continue, simply sat down in the water and waited to die or be rescued, knowing rescue was unlikely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Platoon and company commanders tried to maintain unit cohesion, but it was impossible. The careful assault formations, planned in training, disintegrated. Men clumped together instinctively, seeking the psychological comfort of proximity, even though this made them better targets. Officers shouted orders that could not be heard over the gunfire. Sergeants tried to keep their squads moving forward, leading by example, and were cut down. The organizational structure of the assault began to dissolve into a collection of individuals, each man making his own decision about whether to keep going or to find whatever cover the reef might offer. Those who made it across the reef and reached the beach found no sanctuary. The sea wall that ran along much of Betio's northern shore provided some cover, but it was only 3 to 4 feet high, adequate to stop men from advancing inland but insufficient to protect them from plunging fire or grenades. Marines huddled against this wall, catching their breath, checking their weapons, trying to reorganize into effective units. Many found their rifles had filled with sand and water during the wade and needed to be cleaned before they would function. Ammunition bandoliers were soaked. Radio operators discovered that every radio that had gone into the water was now useless. Communication with ships offshore or between units on the beach became impossible. The beach itself was narrow, perhaps 20 yards from the water's edge to the sea wall. This small strip of sand and coral became crowded with Marines from multiple units, all mixed together, most without their officers or sergeants. Wounded men were carried or crawled to the sea wall, where corpsmen worked on them with whatever medical supplies had survived the landing. The dead were everywhere. Bodies floated in the shallows. Others lay on the sand, often still partially in the water. There was no time for reverence. The living needed every bit of cover and every square foot of space behind the wall. Japanese defensive fire continued without pause. Machine guns positioned in pillboxes just yards. Inland fired through firing ports, their bullets traversing the length of the beach. Marines trying to advance over the sea wall were cut down immediately. Bangalore torpedoes that had survived the wade were pushed forward to blow gaps in the barbed wire beyond the wall, but the men carrying them were exposed for seconds that often proved fatal. Satchel charges intended for pillboxes were difficult to employ when simply raising your head above the wall drew immediate fire. The situation by mid-morning was approaching catastrophic. The assault had lost momentum completely. First, second, and third wave units were jumbled together along a narrow strip of beach or still wading in from grounded landing craft. Casualties were mounting by the minute. Most radios were inoperative, leaving commanders offshore with minimal information about the situation. The naval bombardment had clearly failed to destroy the defensive positions. Japanese fire was intense, accurate, and showed no signs of diminishing, and the tide was still not coming in, meaning reinforcements and supplies would have to wade the same deadly approach the assault waves had crossed. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the 2nd Marines, came ashore around 10 to 100 hours. His command group waded in from a Higgins boat that grounded on the reef. Several of his staff were hit during the wade. Shoup himself was wounded by shrapnel but continued forward. He established a command post in a Japanese bunker that had been captured by one of the assault platoons. Though captured was generous, the Marines controlled the seaward side, but Japanese defenders remained in interior compartments, occasionally throwing grenades through connecting passages. From this position, barely 50 yards inland from the beach, Shoup tried to assess the situation and regain control of the battle. What he saw was chaos. Units were intermixed beyond any hope of sorting them out in the midst of combat. Most company and platoon commanders were casualties. The few radios that worked could not reach ships offshore through the interference of the island's terrain and the damaged state of the equipment. Ammunition was running low because resupply boats could not make it across the reef. Water was already becoming a problem. Men had consumed their canteen water during the stress of the landing, and refilling was impossible. Casualties were overwhelming the medical capabilities. Wounded men lay in rows behind the sea wall with minimal treatment available. Yet Shoup also saw Marines who had made it this far and were not quitting. Small groups had pushed inland, finding gaps in the defences or simply overwhelming positions through close-range combat. A few Sherman tanks had come ashore on LVTs, the only way to get armour across the reef, and were engaging pillboxes point-blank with their 75mm guns. Engineers were clearing wire and improvising paths through the obstacles. Individual Marines armed with flamethrowers, were methodically burning out firing positions one by one. It was not the coordinated assault that had been planned. It was something far more primitive and costly, a series of small unit actions and individual decisions to keep moving forward despite everything, driven by training, leadership, and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The battle for Betio would continue for 3 more days, but the outcome was decided in those first hours on November 20th, 1943. Admiral Shibasaki's defensive theory had worked exactly as designed. The Americans had been devastated at the water's edge, pinned on the beaches, and subjected to withering fire from prepared positions. His men had performed magnificently, maintaining fire discipline, conserving ammunition, and inflicting casualties at a rate that would have broken most attacking forces. But the theory had one fatal flaw. It assumed the Americans would break. They did not. By nightfall on the first day, approximately 5,000 Marines were ashore, clinging to 3 separate beachheads that measured no more than a few hundred yards deep. Casualties already exceeded 1,500 killed and wounded. Equipment losses were staggering. Most radios were destroyed. Approximately half the LVTs that had crossed the reef were knocked out. Only a handful of Sherman tanks had made it ashore. Artillery pieces could not be landed at all. There was no way to get them across the reef. The assault had achieved nothing like the planned objectives. By any reasonable military calculation, it was a disaster. Yet the Marines held. Through the night of November 20th and 21st, Japanese infiltrators probed the lines, trying to find weaknesses. Small counterattacks tested the defenses. None succeeded in driving the Americans back into the sea. When dawn came on the 21st, more Marines were wading ashore across the reef, replacing casualties and reinforcing beachhead. Naval gunfire, adjusted by spotters who had survived the landing, began finding targets more effectively. Carrier aircraft made repeated strikes against identified strongpoints. Admiral Shibasaki was killed on the second day when naval gunfire destroyed his command bunker. Japanese command and control, never robust due to limited radio equipment and the isolated nature of individual pillboxes, began to break down. Individual positions continued fighting with the same determination, but coordinated defense became impossible. Marines, meanwhile, adapted their tactics. Flamethrower teams, demolition specialists, and infantrymen developed a systematic method for reducing pillboxes. Suppress the firing ports with machine gun fire, approach from the blind side, pour gasoline into ventilation openings, ignite it with thermite grenades, then seal the position with satchel charges if any defenders survived. On the third day, November 22nd, Marines pushed across the island's airfield, which had been one of the primary objectives. They linked the separate beachheads into a continuous line. They began reducing the defensive positions one by one, moving methodically through the bunker complexes and trench systems. Japanese resistance remained. Fierce defenders fought from each position until killed, with surrender almost non-existent. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. American materiel superiority, the ability to bring forward fresh troops, ammunition, water, and supplies, gradually overwhelmed the fixed defensive system that had no resupply and no reinforcement. By November 23rd, organized Japanese resistance had ceased. Marines controlled approximately 80% of the island. Remaining defenders occupied isolated positions and fought to the death as these were overrun. The battle was declared officially over at 1330 hours on November 23rd, 76 hours after the first Marines had landed. The final, Butcher's Bill, shocked everyone who saw it. Of the approximately 4,800 Japanese and Korean defenders, only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers survived to be captured. The rest died in their positions. Japanese casualties approached 100%, a level of loss almost unprecedented in modern warfare. American casualties were equally stunning, though for different reasons. The 2nd Marine Division suffered 1,009 killed in action and 2,101 wounded. In 76 hours of fighting, on an island measuring 2 miles by 800 yards, casualties exceeded 3,000 men. The ratio of casualties to acreage made Tarawa one of the bloodiest battles per square yard in American military history. Some rifle companies had suffered 70% casualties. One battalion lost 350 men of its original 800. The human cost was staggering, but the raw numbers, terrible as they were, did not capture the full impact. War correspondent Robert Sherrod came ashore on the first day and witnessed the carnage firsthand. His dispatches, sent back to the United States through military channels, described scenes of unprecedented horror. Bodies floating in the lagoon, so numerous that landing craft had to navigate around them. Wounded men dying in the water before they could reach shore. The smell of death in the tropical heat. The desperate courage of Marines pushing forward despite everything. When his reports reached American newspapers, they caused a sensation. The American public had been following the war through newsreels and newspaper accounts that, while acknowledging casualties, had generally presented American military operations as competent, organized, and steadily successful. Tarawa shattered this narrative. The photographs were particularly devastating. Military photographers had documented the battle extensively, and the images they captured were unlike anything Americans had seen before from the Pacific War. One photograph showed the beach littered with bodies, Marines face down in the sand where they had fallen. Another captured the view from a Higgins boat approaching the reef, with wrecked LVTs burning in the background and bodies floating in the foreground. A third showed the interior of a Japanese pillbox after it had been captured, with the gun still pointed out the firing port and the dead crew sprawled around it. These were not sanitized, distant images of war. They were intimate, graphic documentation of industrial-scale killing. The Roosevelt administration faced a difficult decision. Military censors had previously restricted publication of photographs showing American dead, reasoning that such images would harm morale and give comfort to the enemy. But the scale of the Tarawa casualties made concealment impossible. Too many families would receive telegrams. Too many Marines who had survived would return and tell their stories. In late 1943, the government made the controversial decision to release some of the photographs, believing that the American public needed to understand the true cost of the war. The photographs appeared in Life magazine and major newspapers across the country in December 1943. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some readers were outraged, questioning why such losses had been necessary to capture a tiny island most had never heard of. Others were shocked into a new understanding of what the war actually meant. Still others expressed pride that American servicemen had overcome such horrific conditions to achieve victory. The debate raged in newspapers, in Congress, and around dinner tables across America. Military commanders recognized that Tarawa represented both a victory and a crisis. Yes, the island had been captured. Yes, American forces had proven they could overcome prepared defenses and win against determined resistance. But the casualty rate was unsustainable. If every island across the Central Pacific required comparable losses, the American public would not support the offensive. Changes had to be made, lessons had to be learned. The doctrine had to evolve. Amphibious warfare specialists studied every aspect of the Tarawa assault. They interviewed survivors, examined battle reports, analyzed what had worked and what had failed. Their conclusions led to sweeping changes in American amphibious doctrine that would define operations for the rest of the war. Naval bombardment needed to be longer and more precisely targeted. Aircraft needed to attack immediately before the landing, not hours before. Underwater demolition teams needed to clear obstacles and chart reef passages before the assault. More LVTs were needed enough to carry not just the assault waves but all follow-on forces. Better radios were needed, waterproof versions that could survive the landing. The tide problem led to extensive oceanographic studies. The Navy established teams of specialists who analyzed tide patterns, reef structures, and landing conditions for every subsequent operation. Never again would an assault plan depend on untested assumptions about water depth. The communication failures led to improved radio equipment and new protocols for maintaining command and control during the chaotic first hours of an assault. The casualties among unit leaders led to changes in training, emphasizing leadership at every level so that squads and fire teams could function independently when command structures broke down. These lessons, purchased at such terrible cost at Tarawa, were applied at Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Casualties at these subsequent operations remained. Heavy amphibious assault against prepared defences is inherently costly, but they never again approached the rates seen at Tarawa. The improvements in doctrine, equipment, and planning saved thousands of lives in later battles. But that was cold comfort to the families who received telegrams in December 1943, informing them that their sons, husbands, and brothers had been killed on an island they had never heard of, in the first hours of a battle that shocked the nation. Admiral Shibasaki's boast that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years had been proven catastrophically wrong. Not because his defences were inadequate, they were actually superb, representing the best defensive engineering Japan could produce. Not because his men lacked courage or determination, they fought with extraordinary tenacity and accepted death rather than surrender. The boast failed because it was based on assumptions that did not account for American industrial capacity, doctrinal flexibility, and the willingness of individual Marines to continue attacking despite losses that should have broken any assault. The Japanese defensive theory at Tarawa was sound in its fundamentals. Allowing the enemy to come ashore and then destroying him at his most vulnerable point was logical. The execution was nearly flawless. The defences survived naval bombardment far better than American planners expected. The fields of fire were perfectly arranged, the ammunition supply was adequate, the troops were well trained and committed. Yet, 76 hours after the first Marines landed, the island had fallen and the garrison was annihilated. What Shibasaki and Japanese planners failed to understand was that American military doctrine was not rigid. When the initial assault plan failed, when the LVTs took terrible casualties, and the Higgins boats could not cross the reef, the Marines adapted. Individual units made independent decisions. Small groups found ways forward. Leaders at every level, from colonel to corporal, solved problems without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. This decentralized initiative, deeply embedded in American military culture, allowed the assault to continue even when the command structure was shattered and communication was impossible. The industrial dimension was equally important. Japan could build formidable defences on individual islands, but it could not build them everywhere. Each fortified position required months of work, thousands of tons of concrete and steel, and substantial garrison forces. Japan's limited industrial capacity and shrinking resource base meant these fortifications could only be constructed at selected locations. America, by contrast, could produce landing craft, amphibious vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, radios, and all the other equipment of amphibious warfare in quantities that allowed for losses, experimentation, and adaptation. At Tarawa, approximately 75 LVTs participated in the assault. 20 to 30 were destroyed or disabled. By the time of the Marianas Campaign 6 months later, the Marines had hundreds of LVTs in improved models with better armour and armament. At Tarawa, communication failures crippled coordination. By Saipan, waterproof radios were standard issue. At Tarawa, naval gunfire was inadequate. By later operations, underwater demolition teams, longer bombardments, and better targeting had dramatically improved fire support effectiveness. Every failure was analysed, every loss was studied, every problem generated a solution. This cycle of learning and adaptation, enabled by industrial capacity that could rapidly produce new equipment, gave American forces an advantage no amount of defensive preparation could overcome. For the survivors of Tarawa, both American and the handful of Japanese who were captured, the battle remained the defining experience of their lives. Marines who waded across that reef carried the memory of those who did not make it, They remembered the names, the faces, the men who fell beside them in the water. Some spoke about it freely in later years. Others never discussed it at all, the memories too, painful to revisit. But all of them understood that what they had endured was extraordinary, even by the standards of a war filled with extraordinary events. The Japanese prisoners, those 17 soldiers who survived when 4,800 died, faced a different kind of aftermath. In a military culture that valued death over surrender, their survival carried shame. Some had been captured unconscious, wounded beyond the ability to resist. Others had been trapped in bunkers when Marines sealed the exits, choosing to emerge and surrender rather than die slowly in the darkness. Their post-war lives in Japan were often difficult, marked by the stigma of having survived when their comrades had not. Yet their accounts, given to American interrogators and later to historians, provided crucial insights into the Japanese defensive mindset and the experience of being on the receiving end of American firepower. Batio Island, once a tropical paradise and then a fortified killing ground, became a cemetery. The American dead were eventually exhumed and reinterred in military cemeteries or returned home to their families. The Japanese dead remained, buried in mass graves across the island. In the decades after the war, the island returned to civilian use. Today it is part of the Republic of Kiribati, with a small population living among the remnants of war. Rusted bunkers still dot the landscape. Shells and other ordnance occasionally work their way to the surface. The reef, where so many men died, is calm and beautiful again, showing no trace of the horror it witnessed in November 1943. Admiral Shibasaki's confidence that his fortress was impregnable had not been mere arrogance. It was a reasoned judgment based on military engineering, tactical doctrine, and the capabilities of his garrison. He had built defences that represented the state of the art. He had trained his men thoroughly. He had calculated the mathematical realities of amphibious assault, the vulnerability of men in boats, the difficulty of bringing firepower to bear during the transition from sea to land, the advantage defenders held in prepared positions. All of his calculations were correct. His only error was failing to account for what happened when American Marines, despite taking catastrophic casualties, refused to stop coming. 76 hours, 4,800 Japanese dead, 3,000 American casualties, one tiny island. The fortress that was supposed to hold for 100 years had fallen in just over 3 days, and in falling, it had taught both sides lessons that would echo through the remainder of the Pacific War and reshape amphibious doctrine for generations to come. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.